I'd like to point out that this will be a general read. We're looking at the general influence of the stars upon our life. If you would like to know something more specific about your life and how the stars are specifically interacting with you, I would suggest getting a reading with a professional astrologer. You can do so with me through the link in the description below if you would like. I'd like to give a special welcome to anyone who is new to astrology. You're so welcome here at this channel. If you would like to learn to read your own astrology chart, I offer a short course. It's very cheap and it's lots of fun. The link is in the description below. To all of my friends who join me here each week, who like and share my videos and subscribe to my channel, I do love you. To my gold and silver and bronze star family members, I do pray for you every day. I thank the universe for your presence in my life. If anyone would like to join the Guiding Star family, the link is also in the description below. Hello, I'm Kesenya, and welcome to this series that I've been preparing for you all about Neptune and Neptune's transits through every house in the horoscope and how it will affect your life. Now, I've been wanting to do this series for quite some time now. However, I decided I'd wait until Neptune had crossed my ascendant and my first house lord. In doing so, there's a strategy behind this. I wanted to see how Neptune would play out in my life on those very significant and key points in my chart. Astrology is 50% reading books and doing courses and getting mentors and teachers, and the other 50% is observation and experience of the planets in your life. So the older you get, the more wisdom, the more knowledge that you will have about how planets impact us. So now that I've gone through those particular transits of Neptune in my first house, I feel that I'm ready to talk more in depth about this very watery planet. So let's start by having a look at what Neptune is all about astronomically. So Neptune comes after Uranus in the order of the planets. We have Mercury, Venus, the Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, boom, Neptune. Second to last of the key players in astrology. Pluto is still considered to be a planet of influence in astrological circles, and therefore Neptune is the second last. Now, when Neptune was discovered, it wasn't through observation. They didn't sort of spot Neptune in the sky and go, aha, there it is, because you actually need a telescope to see Neptune. It's not something you can observe with the naked eye. And so Neptune was discovered through mathematics. Basically, the astrologers of the time when Neptune was discovered, and we're going to talk about that when Neptune was discovered in just a minute, but the astrologers of the time were observing Uranus, and they had mathematically predicted where Uranus was going to go according to all their observations, and then Uranus did his usual quirky thing and did not follow the predicted orbit. And so from that, they were able to calculate that there must be a planet further out that's pulling on Neptune, and its gravitational force has caused it to move in a different way than we expected or anticipated. And so because of their mathematical calculations, they began to look for another planet beyond Uranus. And voila, we have Neptune. Now, what is very interesting, and this is quite telling about the character of Neptune actually as well, what is very interesting is that Galileo had observed Neptune back in 1612. He didn't realize that Neptune was a planet. I don't know what he thought it was, but he didn't sort of put two and two together and think, there's another planet out there. So Galileo had observed Neptune, and this was a whole 234 years before the discovery of Neptune. Now, why I say this correlates to sort of the ambiguous nature of Neptune is that he's a bit slippery as a planet. It's hard to sort of pin down. So here was Galileo observing Neptune, not realizing what he was, not sort of seeing it for what it was, basically sort of under an illusion that Neptune was something else. That is a very Neptunian quality, which we'll talk about very soon. But 234 years later, we had the discovery of Neptune in the real through that mathematical observation that I was talking about. This was in 1846. Now, most people know that when we discover new planets, there is often a rise in consciousness or an increase in conscious awareness in humanity on the Earth at the time of the discovery of a new planet. For example, when Uranus was discovered, we had a number of revolutions occurring around the world. What does Uranus correlate to? It correlates to freedom, liberation, equality, and equal distribution of resources. And what were these revolutions about all around the world? Well, namely, the French Revolution was occurring when Uranus was discovered. And that was about no more let them eat cake kind of stuff. No more of the aristocracy living in opulent luxury beyond compare, while the poor people of the land went hungry and could barely clothe and feed themselves. And of course, Uranus, sorry to diverge off Neptune, but Uranus is all about those things, equality. And so the conscious awareness of the planet had reached a point where it was like, no, now hang on, we're not going to take this inequality anymore. We want things to be fairer. We want things to be more even. And lo and behold, at the discovery of Uranus, which rules those things, the consciousness was ripe and ready to embrace that as part of its awareness. Now, the same occurs with Neptune, who was discovered a little while after, as I said, in 1846. So what was the expansion of consciousness that occurred at the time Neptune was discovered? Well, we had an invention of photography that had occurred sort of 20 years before. Now, when we're talking about these big planetary discoveries, this is no mediocre discovery. This is really kick-ass stuff. And so we look at the surrounding sort of, 20, 30 years as an era of the discovery of Neptune. Keep in mind, when I'm talking about this, that up until the discovery of Uranus in the late 1700s, there had the existence of planets beyond what you could see with the naked eye was not known, was not proven. And so for thousands of years, the consciousness of humanity had been in a state where it was only aware of what it could see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. In the real, in the earthly dimension. If you couldn't see beyond Saturn, then there were no planets beyond Saturn. And then all of a sudden, at the discovery of Uranus, boom, we have an awareness of more. And so Uranus was discovered, and then Neptune was discovered. And so the surrounding sort of 30 odd years in the vicinity of 1846 when Neptune was discovered are Neptunian times. And so we look at what was unfolding in consciousness then. And as I've just said a moment ago, photography. Photography was discovered. Neptune rules photography. Motion pictures were discovered 30 years or so after the discovery of Neptune. And Neptune rules motion pictures. The spiritualist movements were unfolding around the world. We started to find people who were interested in sort of hypnosis and mesmerism, people who would be, looking at channeling, people who wanted to conduct seances. These sorts of things started to come into vogue as parlor games, as did the tarot card readings and even astrological readings as sort of, like I said, parlor games, entertainment at fancy people's dinner parties and so on. That was the very glamorous side of Neptunian times, using those spiritualist things as entertainments for glamorous people. Plastics were discovered around this time. Braille for the blind, writing for the blind. Antiseptics. Pasteurization was discovered and started to be used. And these are just a few of the advancements that occurred in society around the time that Neptune was discovered. We also had cultural movements like Romanticism, the poets, Byron and Shelley around this time as well. We had, alongside Byron and Shelley, we had things like the Frankenstein novel or the Dracula novel, which is a very interesting thing. Impressionism was also the painting style en vogue around this era of history. And we also had the Communist Manifesto that was written. Now, some people, if you're not familiar with politics, the name communism can conjure up all sorts of negative imagery in your head. But the idea behind communism was a bit like Uranus in that it was about equality and compassion to everybody. So these are combinations of both Uranian themes, which is equality, and sort of an even playing field for everybody, And also Neptune, which is highly compassionate, wanting everybody to get an opportunity. And of course, Neptune, for those who we haven't got to this point yet, but Neptune rules idealism as well. So the ideal of the Communist Manifesto was present in these Neptunian times as well. Whether it actually functioned and worked was another matter, but the ideal was there. A utopian vision for society is what Neptune is all about, and so there's no surprise that we had movements in that direction towards that ideal at this time. Back to the astronomy, Neptune is a planet that's made up of liquid and ice. And it's also full of different gases as well. So it's quite a combination, Neptune, of many things. But it's very similar in its size and its structure to its nearest planet, which is Uranus. They're almost twin-like in many senses, even though they function very differently astrologically. Like Uranus, Neptune is actually circled by some very faint rings of dust. Uranus's rings are more visible, but Neptune does have rings as well, very light, very faint rings around Neptune. If you've seen images of Neptune that were taken, I think it was by the Voyager space probe, I may be wrong there, but if memory serves me, I think it was Voyager that took images of Neptune, you'll know that it's this beautiful, serene, blue-looking planet that has some wafting sort of white, they look like clouds, around it occasionally. And despite its very serene-looking surface, it is quite a wild planet underneath. So again, that illusionary factor there. On the surface, it looks like it's cool, calm, collected, and underneath, it's not what it seems. On Neptune, winds whip around the planet at, I have to read this, 2,100 kilometers an hour, and they're furious winds. Not only that, Neptune takes only 16 hours to do a rotation. It's heaps bigger than Earth, Neptune, lots bigger than Earth. And we take 24 hours as an Earth to rotate. But if you're a monstrous sized planet and you're spinning, doing a circuit of 16 hours, then the gravitational pull of Neptune becomes pretty phenomenal, despite the fact that you're mostly made up of gas. So this momentum of the gravitational force from the spin and the winds that whip around Neptune sort of whips up all the ice, methane, hydrogen, helium, and ammonia. Had to read that list to make sure I got the chemicals right. Whips it all up into a big slushy mess. So it's not this pure ethereal kind of atmosphere or body of Neptune. It's actually a bit of a slushy, wild mess when you get down to it. Now, some scientists, and this is very interesting, some scientists have hypothesized, just through their calculations and observations, that the core of Neptune, which is burning iron, very fiery, very hot core, they have hypothesized that there is a layer of diamond, liquid diamond, that encircles the core of Neptune. Now, just how they've reached that conclusion, don't ask me, but it is there in scientific journals that this is a hypothesis that could prove true and correct. Now, this iron core that's burning hot, white hot iron core, is actually bigger than the Earth. So the core, the solid mass, if you like, of Neptune is larger than the Earth, and it burns at about, or its temperature is about 5,000 degrees Celsius. So it's incredibly hot, even though it's so far from the sun and distant from the sun's rays, which is usually where heat comes from in the solar system. This Neptune has its own heat source through this burning iron core. So you're getting the picture? We have this impression of Neptune, of serenity on the outside astronomically, but not quite what it seems deep down. And again, we'll see that represented when we start talking about the astrology of Neptune and how it impacts us, and therefore how it's going to impact us when it travels through each house. We also can see that it is a very fluid type planet. It's, slushy, slippery, and of course Neptune rules the watery depths of the ocean, if you're familiar with mythology and the title of Neptune. We'll talk about that in just a second as well. I love the analogy that we're seeing here of this watery fluid planet, but it has a solidness at the core and a preciousness, the liquid diamond. There's something precious at the core of Neptune. Now, Neptune, as we've already stated, is invisible. You cannot see Neptune out on a fine stargazing night. You will always need a telescope to see Neptune. And as the old Hermetic principle goes, as above, so below, the way things appear in the sky from our vantage point on Earth is exactly how they will play out and be represented and reflected in our lives on the planet. What does that mean? Well, it means that the planets we can see with the naked eye, the visible planets, in astrology, they correlate and connect to what we experience visibly, tangibly, experientially on the Earth. Our touch, taste, sight, sound, and smell. You know, the physical things of the experience of being a body incarnate on the Earth connect to visible planets and what they rule. When you get to Neptune, actually when you get to Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, they're all invisible without a telescope, and therefore they connect to the inner realm of the psyche, what motivates us unconsciously, you know, our behavioral patterns, our things we can't help about ourselves, you know, our deep psychological wounds and our karmas that we carry with us at the core of our self, at our soul level. They correspond to these invisible planets because as above, so below. We can't see them, therefore it's like the part of the iceberg that sits underneath the water. You can't see it, but it's still there packing a whopping punch, especially if you happen to be on the Titanic. So Neptune has at least 14 moons that circle it. It has a greater and denser gravity than the Earth. So if you're standing on Neptune, you will weigh a lot more than you do on the Earth. And it takes longer than one lifetime for Neptune to circle the sun. It takes 165 years. So in your lifetime, you will never see Neptune return to its natal place in your astrological chart. You just won't live that long, at least not in this day and age as I'm recording this video. Who knows what science might do in the future, but right now you won't live to be 165 and see Neptune come back to its natal position. Let's explore Neptune mythologically now. Well, Neptune is the name of the Roman god of the sea. Not only the sea though, in the oceans, but also of freshwater. Neptune was the Roman god of freshwater as well. And we often see Neptune in mythological pictorial representation with his trident. And of course, what is the symbol of Neptune astrologically? It's a trident. So there we go. There's so much correlation between the mythologies and what plays out in the skies again here. So again, there's no coincidences that when the astronomers discovered Neptune, they didn't know that it was made mostly of liquid and gas. They didn't know it was mostly a fluid planet. But lo and behold, here we are. They gave it the name Neptune, king of the oceans, and Neptune is quite an oceanic planet with its liquid mass. Once again, this is showing us how the conscious awareness works, even in unconscious ways. Now, a little bit more about Neptune mythologically was that he was the son of the Titan god Saturn. Now, along with Neptune, there was Jupiter and there was Pluto that were the sons of Saturn. And Jupiter, Neptune, Pluto didn't really get along with Saturn very well. If you're familiar with the mythology of Saturn and Jupiter, you'll know that the mother of Jupiter hid him away because Saturn had a habit of eating his children lest they rise up against him and take over. So theoretically, in the mythology, Neptune and Pluto were gobbled up by their father Saturn. But then along came Jupiter when he was all grown up to the rescue, and Saturn regurgitated his offspring, Neptune and Pluto. There were others as well, but the main ones were Neptune and Pluto, the brothers of Jupiter. And together, Jupiter, Neptune and Pluto overthrew their father Saturn, and Jupiter became king of the gods. And we had the reign of the Olympian gods from that point on, which include Neptune and Pluto. So Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto are the Olympian gods. Saturn was the Titan god. And Uranus, who was the father of Saturn, just to confuse matters even further, was not a Titan and not an Olympian. He was sort of one of the forefathers of them all. In ancient Greece and Rome, they celebrated the role of water in their lives, and they had a festival to celebrate this, and it was known as Neptunalia. There was also another festival that occurred at the similar time called Furinalia. I won't go into the mythology of that name, but they were both celebrated around the same time. So July 23rd and July 25th, the role of water and the preciousness of water in life was celebrated with these festivals. So Neptunalia, it was a time of honoring the god Neptune and its watery association. So let's take a peek at the astrology of Neptune. I'm going to tell you all about Neptune astrologically. What is Neptune about? Well, as we've already come across, Neptune is about illusion, seeing something and actually realizing it's something else. It's not what it seems. So that can be a number of things can be displayed that way. Glamour is ruled by Neptune, because if you're glamorous, you've got amazing makeup and hair and beautiful, shimmering, gorgeous clothes and stuff. You look very glamorous, but is that who you really are? When you wake up in bed in the morning, and your hair's a tousled mess and you haven't got makeup on and you're wearing your baggy old t-shirt, you might not look glamorous. So glamour is ruled by Neptune because it's part of that deception, if you like, but not a bad deception. It's just a deception. It's not what it seems. Neptune, in that sense, rules glamour. Neptune, as we've already discussed, rules a desire to return to Utopia, to achieve Utopia, to create heaven on earth, so to speak. So that can be a very positive thing if we're wanting to make the world a better place. And Neptune is also quite a compassionate planet. There is a lot of unconditional love that goes along with Neptune, brotherly love, the idea of anyone can be saved from their horrible life or, their difficulties or their own ill choices in life. Neptune has this sort of unconditional love. Some might refer to that as this redeemer quality about it. And Neptune can be connected to miracles as well, because if somebody is raised up from the muck and mire into a wonderful life, well, that is often seen as a miracle. And that transformation that occurs is a very Neptunian associated thing in astrology. Part of this desire for utopia can actually have connections to a longing to escape the horror and the harshness of earthly reality. And those of us who are very Neptunian, who have a strong Neptune in our chart, or even a strong 12th house or a strong Pisces, will know what this is all about. The wanting to escape from earth and earth realities because they're too hard to bear. They're fearful. Earth is a fearful place for these highly sensitive Neptunian, Piscean, 12th house souls, and it's almost too hard. So Neptune is also associated with tremendous longing to tap out, to escape, a longing to go to heaven. Now you'll see a lot of religious groups, fanatical religious groups going down this road where it doesn't matter what I endure in this lifetime, I will be rewarded when I go to heaven. And that's all they're living for. They don't even engage in earthly reality and earthly life because it's only about heaven and getting to heaven after this horrible life is over. That's a Neptunian thing. Also, Neptune has this idea about it of wanting to return to the watery depths, i.e. the womb, being in the embryonic fluid, being safe and secure, not having to sort of struggle and make it on our own because, hey, we've got everything we need. We're warm, we're safe, we're fed, we're in the womb. And Neptune has this desire for that too. So it's a dual desire for paradise, heaven, but also at the same time a desire to, return to the safety and security of home, so to speak. Neptune can also give a longing to be saved. You want your hero to come along and rescue you from this, terrible existence. That's a Neptunian longing. But also, if we find that we desire to be the rescuer, we want to be somebody's hero, that's a Neptunian thing as well. So there's often a spiritual connection with Neptune, and I'm sure from what I've just described, you can see connections in religious circles to savior mentality, redeemer qualities, longing for paradise. You can see where Neptune's getting its sort of shadow side of spirituality popping up there in religious, ideology. But Neptune is also in the positive side, which I love to talk about more, is the beautiful connection to angelic realms, to the divine. So if we channel higher wisdom, higher knowledge, that's a Neptune thing. If we're channeling creativity, beauty, art, if we're channeling unconditional love. And now I'm talking about channeling here, not in the sort of, some entities speaking through me, although that is a Neptunian thing. I'm talking about simply expressing things that come from beyond us. Beautiful things, gracious things, ethereal things, things that come from beyond the earthly plane. That spiritual side of Neptune is so beautiful. So Neptune is the manifestation of divine love, divine grace, and divine creativity, divine creative ideals. He is connected to visualization, imagination, and even healing through visualization and imagination. The idea that through your thought processes and lifting them to a higher plane, dreaming and aspiring of what it could be, that you can heal yourself. And again, we come back to the miraculous component here, where people are miraculously healed. Neptune has connections to hypnosis as well, and mesmerism. In fact, Mesmer was the man who developed the idea of being hypnotized as a form of healing. So the two are very similar. And so Neptune has connections with this as well. It's all very interesting, but Neptune is actually a planet that it's hard to define him, and I use the word him loosely, as a masculine planet. Now, Neptune as a god was a masculine god, but the expression of Neptune is actually very feminine. It errs on the feminine side. So it would be very interesting to understand exactly how they reached the concept in ancient mythology that Neptune, the god of the oceans, was actually a man. I feel maybe that came about at the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans when the patriarchy was establishing itself, because really the expression of Neptune is this compassionate, unconditionally loving, highly creative energy, which connects more to the water signs and the watery energy, which is feminine in astrology. So very interesting there. Neptune is a more feminine energy expression. Neptune rules the sign of Pisces in modern astrology, and of course that is a water sign as well. Neptune is also in astrology neither benefic nor malefic. So that means, we don't put a label of good or bad on him. But really with Neptune, it depends what aspects you have to your placement of Neptune in the chart, whether he will manifest his shadow side or whether he will manifest his light side in your life. And we've kind of talked a little bit about both here now. I will talk further about the shadow side in just a second. But if you have mostly good aspects, like a conjunction, we can classify that as a good aspect, or perhaps a trine or a sextile to Neptune from other planets, then it's looking good for you. Neptune will tend to express in its more angelic form. It's more miraculous, blessed form. But if you have quite a mixed bag, maybe you've got some squares to your Neptune, maybe you've got some oppositions to your Neptune. If that's what it's looking like, then you may end up with a bit more of the shadow side exhibiting in your personality or what you attract in your life. Let's explore what that is all about. Well, some of the shadow side of Neptune is in the desire for utopia. We want to see evil people punished. And you'll see this a lot expressing in religions, where we just want everyone who's bad to go to hell. And that's actually a shadow Neptunian energy, because we want to preserve utopia for the pure and everyone else can suffer, So that's a shadow side expression of Neptune. Narcissism can be connected with Neptune's shadow side as well. And so can masochism, actually. If we think about this desire to be seen as holy and pure, often that connects to making ourselves falsely humble and lower than another person. And that can incite in another person distaste, and disgust for another person who is falsely humble. And of course, if you're familiar with the idea of masochism, then you know that it's about debasing yourself in order that you might feel more worthy or more holy because you've made yourself lowly. It's a very slippery, shall we say, concept. And again, not everything is as it seems. It might seem with someone who is in a masochist state that they don't care about themselves, that they don't love themselves, that they're being cruel to themselves. But very often under the surface is this energy of wanting, the best way I can describe it, to be pure through making yourself lowly, like the flagellants did in ancient medieval times through whipping themselves. Oh, they're so pure and holy because they're whipping themselves for Christ. You know, it's that kind of idea. Odd one, but not everything is as it seems with Neptune and Neptune's shadow side. Projection is something that is actually a Neptunian behavioral quality coming from this psychological depth. If we have separation anxiety, that's a shadow side of Neptune. Of course it is, because we are longing to return to the womb. And when we're separate from that safe space, separation anxiety. So if you're looking at those psychological issues in a chart and, assessing that, look at Neptune and what Neptune's doing in the chart. Shadow side of Neptune can be idealization, where we don't see a person clearly for who they are, but we put them on a pedestal. So celebrity culture would be one expression of that. Anyone we put on a pedestal and hold up there, and we create an illusion around that person. It's not the truth. It's not real. It's not what is really going on at the core of a person to have them up on a pedestal and think that, oh my God, they're so perfect. That's idealization, and that's Neptune shadow side, as is hysteria, as is addiction. Addiction's another expression here. And why? Because addiction is escapism. If we're addicted to drugs, usually with Neptune involved, it's because we want to get away from the harshness of reality. If we're addicted to alcohol, again, it's an escape mechanism and it's an escape valve, but not a healthy one, because reality is too harsh and we just long to get out of here. Obviously, deception is a shadow side of Neptune, because if you're creating an illusion, while there can be sort of times when that's good, as in the case of glamour and that's fun and what have you, sometimes when we are creating an illusion, we're deceiving others. We're pulling the wool over their eyes. We're not being our true self, and that is a shadow Neptune expression. Sacrifice, I would say, is a shadow Neptunian expression. Again, it comes in close context with this false humility kind of behavior. If we feel that we have to sacrifice ourselves for another person, then we're kind of making ourselves to be better than the other person. I'll go in, I'll sacrifice myself, and then that person will be saved. And there's a false humility about it, a deceptive humility that goes along with that. And of course, oftentimes when people have strong Neptune representations in the chart, they lose themselves, they martyr themselves for the sake of another. Does that benefit their life? No, usually. But it might make them feel spiritually greater, or that they have been a noble person. Again, we've got this sacrifice energy that's a bit not what it seems, and this is also the shadow side of Neptune. Victimization. Victimization is another Neptunian energy where, poor me, I am suffering because life has been unkind, and therefore I am longing to get away from life, and return to the womb or go to paradise because I have been victimized. Instead of being our own savior, instead of making the best of things and doing what we can to transform our karma, no, we're a victim and we just want to escape. That's so Neptunian shadow side. Especially, you could call it suffering that's seen as purity. So these are some of the Neptunian shadow energies. I don't want to leave it on that though. There are good things, obviously, that Neptune correlates to. We've talked about some of these, but, others might be the belief that there is enough for everybody, and that the universe can be kind and the universe has our back. In fact, transcendence of matter is a very big Neptunian theme. The belief that eventually good will win over evil. That's Neptunian as well. Jesus' teachings. Jesus' teachings were very Neptunian. He was, after all, the avatar for the age of Pisces, which was ruled by Neptune. So compassion, unconditional love, we've talked about that. Forgiveness, healing, all these things, divine healing, miraculous healing. These are Neptunian ruled things. So Jesus was a big representation of Neptune energy in the positive. The most creative and artistic planet, we've already talked about that. And it's actually at its strongest capacity in water signs. So Neptune does very well in Pisces, Cancer, or Scorpio. She will tend to give the best results if that's where he is in your natal chart, but also if that's where he's transiting at any given time, he's going to give the better side of himself to you. Neptune rules the color light blue. Hence, I have my blue blouse on here today for this video, but I've also worn my very well, you might not be able to see it because the color in this camera doesn't actually come up that good. I need to get a new camera, but it's actually a very beautiful velvet jacket that's ocean color, like the kind of tranquil turquoise that we see up on the beaches of Queensland or some beautiful tropical beaches. And I thought, seeing as Neptune rules these gorgeous oceans, I would wear my beautiful aqua turquoise color velvet jacket with my light blue Neptunian top. Neptune can also have connections to lavender, purpley colors also. Hence, we see often people who work in spiritual, sort of new agey fields have a lot of purple going on, because often they might not be aware of this even, but they're probably highly Neptunian people. They have a strong Neptune in their chart, and so the purple element tends to come through quite a lot, and you'll see a lot of, websites and stuff with purple this and lavender that on many spiritual sites. Neptune rules the gemstone amethyst as well, and so amethyst has a lot of qualities to it that correlate very strongly to Neptune. Some tangible things, and I did say in the beginning Neptune's more psychological. Yep, that's true, very true, but Neptune does have some governance of certain items on the planet, namely because of what was happening at the time Neptune was discovered, what things were starting to be used and utilized when Neptune was discovered, and therefore Neptune gets the rulership of those things. So the ocean, obviously, but oils, plastics, impressionism, film, photography, advertising, poisons, escapism, that's not actually a tangible thing, but that's obviously something Neptune rules, drugs. As I've already illustrated, a lot of these things were being discovered. Film, photography, medications, the shipping industry, steam-powered ships were really starting to get a Guernsey around the time that Neptune came along. So shipping and the oceans, all of these things, highly Neptunian. Now, in my level 1 astrology course that is coming out, you can learn more about Neptune and the things Neptune rules, and we go into greater depth with Neptune there and its rulerships. So if you're interested in knowing more, check out that course. But what does Neptune want? It wants unwavering trust, unwavering love, and unwavering belief that the divine will come through for you. Even in the face of no evidence at all, Neptune wants us to believe. If you are 40 odd years old and you've never had a boyfriend, Neptune is saying, keep believing and the miracle can happen. And I would encourage you, if that's the case, well, wait till you're 42. Who knows? Neptune, when it reaches its maturation at 42, may just bring you what you've been waiting for. So that's a short look at the beautiful and quite intriguing and unusual planet of Neptune. Now let's have a look at what Neptune is all about when he travels through a house in the horoscope and what he's going to do for you while he's there. So how do we find out where Neptune is currently transiting and in what house of our chart it is? Well, I would suggest going to an app like planetwatcher.com. It's a great app. It shows you where planets are at any given point in time. So if you go there today, it will instantly show you where the planets are today at the moment that you go to that app. It's very helpful. And if you look for the glyph of Neptune, the symbol of the trident, which is Neptune's glyph, you will find what sign Neptune is currently sitting in. And from that, we can then go to your chart and determine which house Neptune is transiting through. So for example, if Neptune is in Pisces, we need Pisces to be our 5th house from our rising sign. Let me show you what that would look like. Scorpio, in this example, would be the rising sign. So I've put my little arrow to mark Scorpio as the rising sign. And if we count 5 whole sign houses from Scorpio, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get to Pisces. And in our example chart, that is where Neptune is transiting. And so we would therefore be able to absorb this video knowing that it was applying to us. Now, if you are a different rising sign, and let's say Neptune is in the sign of Pisces, then you'll need to work out which house Neptune is currently transiting in your chart. But for the sake of this video, if you have Neptune in the 5th house, 5 whole sign houses from the rising sign, then this is the information you'll need. Well, the 5th house has to do with a few different things. It's quite a diverse house. It has to do with our ego. It has to do with self-expression. It correlates to themes of love and coupled with that romance, dating, but also the things that we love in life. It also has to do with children, and it has to do with the source of our joy. So when Neptune is transiting here, it's going to affect all of those themes. Let's start with ego, firstly. Well, when Neptune is transiting through the 5th house, it takes about 14 years to move through a sign or a house. It's a time when over this period, not instantaneously like that, but over the 14-year period, you may find more and more that your ego is being dissolved. What does that actually mean? Well, ego is sense of self and sense of uniqueness and sense of I am. Whereas Neptune wants you to be one with everything, removing boundaries, and ego is a type of boundary, and it wants to sort of bring you into oneness with everything. So you might find that your own sense of uniqueness, your own sense of self might be gradually being dissolved in some way, because Neptune and ego, they're like oil and water. They don't gel very well. They don't mix very well at all. Neptune wants oneness, and the ego is all about the self. So it can be a very confronting transit because of that. You might be going through experiences that not undermine your ego exactly, but cause you to think about who you are and your relationship to the world. Now, it's also a wonderful time, so there's confrontation with the ego dissolving, but it's also a wonderful time for embracing a more Neptunian approach to being in the world. And that would include being more compassionate, being more kind, more selfless, as Elvis sang, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And by doing that, you actually develop empathy and sympathy. Well, actually not sympathy, empathy for others. And that's a valuable expression of Neptune in this house. Now, if we have a strong ego, and a lot of Western societies have raised their people to be quite egoic and all about the self, if we have a strong ego, this energy, this transit is very disruptive to our psyche. Because obviously, Neptune's not an ego smasher, but it's an ego dissolver. So we're going to find a lot of who we think we are is dissolved because of this transit. But if we are humble by nature, if we are oriented towards oneness and service and being, as I said, humble, then this transit is a lot easier. As I've already illustrated, Neptune is the antithesis of individuality. And so this is the house, the 5th house is the house of distinctiveness and uniqueness. So Neptune's manner of dealing with things is infiltrating like a fog creeping in. And so we're going to find this, this distinctiveness, this uniqueness is gradually, unobtrusively kind of eroded away. And so self-confidence can actually flounder during this period. Now, this all sounds really heavy, but it has a divine purpose of letting go of superiority, letting go of pride, letting go of thinking that we are top dog, which is actually really healthy, and seeing how we're connected with everyone and everything and our place in the universe. I think it's a really healthy thing. Even though it can be a difficult experience, it leads us ultimately, by the end of this 14-year transit, to a place of higher consciousness with regard to who we are and our place in the universe. Now, Neptune in the 5th will also have an effect on love and romance and dating, obviously. It's actually like Neptune is the highest manifestation of love. It is unconditional love. It is divine love. And so this may very well be a time where you will connect with or embrace or experience the highest manifestation of love in your life, which sounds wonderful. But there's a shadow side to everything. We're going to explore the shadow and light sides of Neptune here dealing with love. Love will take on a new dimension during this 14-year period, and we may find that we become more devoted. If we're in a partnership, we might become more devoted to our partner. We might just look to be devoted to someone in some way. Neptune is the planet of devotion. It's also a planet of idealization and admiration, and so our love experiences are going to contain a lot of devotion, idealization, and admiration for partners. It becomes about what we can give rather than what we can get, and I just think that's fabulous. I wish there was more of that in the world. I mean, relationships would be far more successful if everybody had the attitude of what can I give to this rather than what am I getting from this. In a nutshell, we become far more considerate in our relationships with Neptune moving through here, more refined, let's say. But in the shadow side, I want to warn everybody who's having this transit to be careful of their love relationships, particularly if you happen to be single and dating over this 14-year period. Be careful of your sexual partners, be careful of who you are attracting into your life romantically, because Neptune dissolves boundaries. And Neptune's discernment is not known for being stellar. Quite the opposite, actually. Neptune here might make your discernment quite off with regard to partners. So you may like to seek some advice from grounded, level-headed friends, etc. Coupled with that, do be careful of overly emotional attractions and unrealistic attractions where you might be sort of not seeing people in their true light, perhaps because your emotions get in the way of your logic. Now, we find that most relationships do have an emotional basis in society today, but you don't want to throw logic out the door as well. You want to bring that into, and Neptune has a habit of sort of kicking logic to the curb. So you must bring in logic however you can, whether that's through the advice of a friend, whether that's through detaching in your mind and observing in a very logical, analytical way what's going on. These are approaches that might help you during this time in your love relationships. We really want to be careful about falling in love with an ideal rather than falling in love with reality. And this is the hiccup, this is the stumbling block of Neptune in the 5th house. We may find that we could fall in love with unavailable people during this transit, somebody who's married or somebody who's already in a relationship or dating a few different people and, at the same time, and we fall in love with that person. Or we idolize a celebrity and we fall in love with a celebrity and, somebody who's completely out of realistic reach. In the positive side too, we might find that we fall in love with a Neptunian person, somebody who's creative, somebody who is spiritual, mystical, mysterious types of people, musicians, artists, yoga teachers, meditation instructors, people who are in Neptunian fields are the kind of people we might fall in love with during this transit. But one good thing to know is that even if relationships don't last long, and I'm not saying that they are going to be short-lived with Neptune here. That's Neptune doesn't indicate something will only last a momentary piece of time. But Even if a relationship is short-lived during this time, it's going to up-level you. It's going to take you to higher planes of spiritual understanding of yourself and your place in the world. It's going to bring you more romance, more eroticism in your life, and change your perspective about love. So all relationships that happen under this influence are for the greater good, provided we see them that way, of course. Now, Neptune is also longing. Neptune is the planet of longing for what we don't have. And of course, Neptune in the fifth house might see us longing for romance that's not present in our life, whether we're single or married. You can be in a relationship and have no romance. And you might find that you're longing for something better than what you have in terms of romance. Longing for an ideal love scenario, and so you might find that you're getting the 50 Shades of Grey books out, or the Mills and Boon or whatever, and devouring novels like that, or stories like that, or films like that at this time to fuel a longing for love that is fanciful, fantasized, not grounded in reality. One of the other shadow sides regarding love and Neptune in the fifth house is there can be confusion around sex, not your sexuality, not your sexual expression, but around sex itself, the role of sex. And, this is the house of sex for play, sex for fun. And Neptune can bring confusion to that. You're out there having a fine time, with a committed partner or on a dating scene, and how you are experiencing and seeing sex might be completely different to what the other person is experiencing and seeing sex. And so, your perception might be very foggy about what this sexual experience is all about and what it means. And you can become confused about the role of sex and sexual expression in your life. Moving on to another topic that has to do with the fifth house, and that is children. It is a beautiful house in that regard. People of a certain age, when they have this transit, so if you're having this 14-year transit and you're in your sort of child rearing years, or you're in that age where you want to have a baby, you may find that you adopt under this influence, because Neptune has to do with adoption in certain situations. If you don't adopt, you might actually find that you're drawn towards compassionate, Neptune is compassion, compassionate work with children or for children to benefit children in the world. I might also add that if you're of childbearing years, you may have an unwanted pregnancy during this time. So a couple of things that Neptune can trigger. Now, usually those incidents would happen when Neptune crosses the manifestation point for the fifth house, because they're pretty big epochs in life when those sorts of things happen, adopting a child or having an unwanted pregnancy. And Neptune crossing the manifestation point for the fifth house could be a trigger for those events in our life. Sometimes, I'm not saying this is a definite, but this is one of the manifestations that has been proven to occur. We need to be careful during this transit of idolizing our children. Remember, Neptune is a planet that idealizes things, and we can put our children on a pedestal and think they're far greater than they actually are. Because this is the house of our children in general, and particularly the house of the firstborn, we may find that Neptune, which has to do with faraway places, places of isolation, that our child or our children may go to boarding school now, or to move to a faraway place in some way. So obviously boarding school, boarding houses, they're sort of more isolated places. They're not for everyone, they're not for the masses, and Neptune rules those sorts of places. And of course, children, fifth house, going to a faraway foreign place perhaps, or going to a place of isolation like a boarding school. That's not uncommon either. Relationships with children can be somewhat confusing because, of course, Neptune is a planet of confusion. You may not be seeing your children in an objective light during this 14-year period, and there can be far too much emotionalism wound up with your interactions with your children. So the more conscious and aware you can be of that, the more you can observe yourself being overly emotional, or however it's expressing, the more you can deal with that influence of Neptune in the fourth house, which I feel would be a shadow expression of Neptune here. You might find that your children start to get involved in Neptunian things. They might suddenly become more creative, more self-expressive in the creative realms. Might suddenly get an interest in filmmaking or photography or costume design or something. And your children just immerse themselves in those kind of fields, or they might become super spiritual, super mystical. They might even go through some sort of miraculous healing process in some way themselves, depending on obviously the age of your children and what they may need healing from. The shadow side of this is that your children could also get involved in difficult Neptunian things. Now, this would be seen by looking at your natal Neptune, and if your natal Neptune has hard aspects to it, and a lot of hard aspects, it could indicate that during this transit your children might get involved in addictive things like drugs, like alcohol, maybe addicted to sort of food as a comfort factor or something, some sort of addiction that's not good for them. So be very wary of that and look for the telltale signs if your children are in going into those sorts of experiences. Now, the 5th house is also the house of our inner child and our childlike heart. So because Neptune is the planet of longing, it can cause us to long to return to the childlike state, to that, like if we had a good childhood, it might be that we are longing to return to the freedom and the love and the peace of our upbringing and our childhood. Or if we didn't have a good childhood, we might be fantasizing about what could my childhood have been like? Who would I be if I hadn't gone through what I'd gone through? We might even begin to sort of create a new childlike experience. For example, when I had an aspect of Neptune to my 5th house manifestation point, I went through a period where I was collecting Barbie dolls. Now, as a child, I loved playing with Barbies and doing role play and what have you. And then in my 30s, 40s, when Neptune was aspecting my 5th house, I started collecting pop culture Barbies again. And here are a couple of examples of those Barbies. So just because I want to share them, my I Dream of Jeannie Barbie. My Mad Men Joan Barbie. Julie Newman Catwoman Barbie. Audrey Hepburn Sabrina Barbie. And I could go on, but I won't bore you with that. But this is just an example of how we can return to our childlike heart and our childhood experiences when we have a Neptune transit in the 5th house. Now, this could also manifest in less material ways, perhaps where you return to the dreams and the fantasies that you had as a child. And as I said, you might start to create a utopian ideal of what a childhood could be. Maybe you get in touch with your inner child for the first time in your life and you start to do childlike things, to play more, to escape into realms of fantasy and like children do, to dress up more, to put on costumes and go pretend to be somebody more. Like I'm thinking of maybe some subcultures, or you decide you're going to do face painting as a fairy for children's parties or something. You start to embrace and get in touch more with your childlike heart and childlike sense of playfulness. Also, our creativity and our spiritual work can also be vehicles for getting in touch with our inner child again. So we might do some art therapy that takes us back to our childhood, or we might start to connect with spiritually our inner child and speak to our inner child, encourage and uplift our inner child and love our inner child. So spiritual work and creative work can fuel this connection with the childlike self. Now, on the topic of creative expression, this is also another 5th house element. This is a time of, when Neptune transits here for 14 years, of increased psychic downloads for creativity. So if you want to do art therapy, there won't be a better time in your whole life than when Neptune's transiting the 5th house, because you will tap into psychically those parts of yourself from the past or that have to do with your psychological self and express them creatively in the most beautiful, deep, profound, revealing ways. But even if you're not channeling past experiences, you might find that this is a wonderful transit for creative work in general. So it's a time, if you're into filmmaking or art or sculpture or costume design or whatever, this is a time when you will do the most prolific, most beautiful work of your life. A time when you will really shine, when your higher self, your spiritual self on the spiritual plane is giving you insights and downloads that are going to sort of shoot you off like a rocket into your artistic sphere, if that's the realm that you work in. You'll be inspired, your imagination will be off the charts. Go for it. This is a wonderful time for productive creativity. Now, Neptune is not a planet that usually brings worldly success to people, but if you are working in fields like as an actor or an actress, in filmmaking in some way, as a photographer, maybe in fantasy realms, like I said, costume design or party fairy or something like that, if you're working in spiritual fields, if you're working in healing, this 14-year transit could be a time when you attain more worldly success, more perhaps celebrity status for those Neptunian things that you are working with. And one of the reasons why our creativity abounds now, and our ability to sort of use our creative expression, it's because Neptune is boundaryless, and it stops any self-censorship that we have of our own creativity. So the censorship of, oh, that's not good enough, oh, nobody will ever appreciate that, or who am I to think that I could write this or paint this, that goes now. Neptune dissolves those limiting boundaries on our self-expression, and we just go for it. Any new idea that comes, boom, we transform it into some sort of self-expression. So it's a wonderful time for creativity. Finally, the 5th house has to do with joy. It's a house of joy, and where we can find our joy. So this is a period where our heart can open to joy. Now, not in some sort of shocking, revelatory, epiphany type way. It's more insidious than that. It will gradually creep in, and who we are at the end of this transit will be completely different to who we were at the beginning of this transit, and we won't even notice the slowly infiltrating changes that have taken place. But we will be more open to joy, more receptive to joy, have no boundaries to joy entering into our life by the end of this transit. You will not see the world in the same way again. So our ability to appreciate life's joys will also become boundless. We will see beauty in places we never saw beauty before. We will experience joy in ways we never experienced joy before. And we will see all the hallmarks of spirit in all the pleasurable, joyful, happy things that we experience in life. We will see spirit in everything wonderful. So in that sense, this can be a truly beautiful transit. Enjoy it.